Don't you want to try the coffee I made just for you, sweetheart? My husband, Daniel, asked, his voice smooth, but his smile not quite reaching his eyes. I sat at my sister-in-law Olivia's grand dining table in her Charleston home, where our family gathered for brunch once a month. The cup of coffee in front of me had a strange, almost metallic smell that made my stomach churn. My name is Rachel, and at 34, I never imagined I'd be questioning whether my own husband was trying to poison me. But after 3 years of marriage, and more than a few suspicious bouts of food poisoning, I'd learned to be cautious. Especially around Olivia. She had a talent for orchestrating situations that left me sick, embarrassed, or both, always with that same innocent smile Daniel was wearing now. "How thoughtful of you," I replied, forcing a smile while my mind raced. The aroma from the cup was off. It reminded me of last month, when I ended up in urgent care after drinking tea at Olivia's house. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong, and Olivia had insisted she made my tea exactly the same way she made her own. From across the table, Olivia stirred her own untouched coffee, watching me intently. "Daniel's been quite the coffee expert lately," she said with a smirk. "Experimenting with different brewing techniques. Just for you." The way she emphasized "for you" sent a shiver down my spine. I had noticed Daniel spending more time at Olivia's house lately, claiming they were planning a surprise for our upcoming anniversary. But something felt wrong. The hushed conversations that stopped when I walked into the room, the unreadable texts I glimpsed on his phone, and now this coffee with an unfamiliar, unsettling scent. Lifting the cup, I pretended to take a sip while studying their faces. Daniel and Olivia exchanged a glance, fleeting but unmistakable. A sharp jolt of fear shot through me. "Stay calm, Rachel. Think." Making a show of checking my phone, I suddenly stood up. "Oh! Would you look at that? I need to make a quick work call." I glanced at Olivia. "Mind if I use your study?" As I stepped around the table, I accidentally bumped into Olivia's chair, causing just enough chaos to discreetly swap our coffee cups. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I gasped, steadying myself. Such a klutz. Olivia gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Just don't break anything in the study." I nodded, my pulse thudding in my ears, and walked toward the study. But I didn't go inside. Instead, I stopped just beyond the doorway where I could still see them. Now, I just had to wait. From my hidden vantage point, I watched Olivia lift the coffee cup, the one meant for me, to her lips. My stomach twisted. Part of me wanted to call out, to stop her. But another part needed to know. I had spent too many nights curled in agony, too many hours in sterile emergency rooms, always after meals with them. It wasn't always like this. When I met Daniel 5 years ago at a wedding in Charleston, he was charming, attentive. Olivia had welcomed me warmly, inviting me to family gatherings, even helping plan our wedding. But in hindsight, I should have seen the red flags, the way she accidentally spilled drinks on my dress at events, the way my food always had extra seasoning when she helped cook. The incidents started small. A mild stomachache here, a slight allergic reaction there. Daniel always had an excuse. "Maybe it was something you ate earlier. You must be coming down with something." But the pattern was undeniable. The worst was 2 months ago. I had breakfast at their house and ended up in the hospital. The doctors found traces of something in my system they couldn't quite identify. Daniel convinced everyone it was a fluke. But I knew better. Now, standing in the study, I watched Olivia take a sip. Then another. Her fingers curled around the cup as she set it down. Seconds ticked by. And then, Olivia's expression flickered. Her mouth tightened. Her hands trembled slightly. She swallowed hard, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. Daniel frowned. "Olivia? Are you okay?" Her breathing turned shallow. I stepped forward. "Something wrong, Olivia?" She jerked her head toward me, eyes widening in realization. I smiled. "You made that coffee just for me, right?" Silence. Daniel's gaze darted between us, confusion turning to something else, panic. And in that moment, I knew the truth. They weren't just messing with me. They had meant for me to drink that. And now, Olivia was tasting her own medicine. I exhaled, steadying myself. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in years, I wasn't the one at their mercy. Now, it was my turn to make a move. I gripped the doorframe, my breath shallow as I watched Olivia take another sip of the coffee. Across from her, Daniel was typing on his phone, seemingly unconcerned. My own untouched cup sat cold on the table, the metallic scent still lingering in the air, making my stomach twist. Then I saw it, a slight tremor in Olivia's hand as she set the cup down. Her normally composed face had gone pale. "Daniel," she murmured, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong." Daniel looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion before his expression morphed into horror. His eyes darted to the coffee cup in front of Olivia, and I saw the exact moment he realized what had happened. He shot up so fast his chair clattered to the floor. "Olivia, what's happening?" Her hands were trembling violently now. She tried to stand but stumbled, grabbing the edge of the table for support. "Daniel, what did you put in that coffee?" Her voice was a strangled whisper. I stepped out of the study, my phone already recording. Daniel was at her side in an instant, his face ashen. That wasn't supposed to be your cup," he whispered. But in the silence of the dining room, his words rang out like a gunshot. Olivia's eyes widened in horror. "Call an ambulance," she gasped, sliding to the floor. "Please, I can't." I dialed 911 immediately, my voice calm despite the chaos unfolding before me. "Emergency services? We need an ambulance at 725 Oakwood Lane." I kept my phone recording with my other hand. "My sister-in-law appears to be having a severe reaction to something in her coffee. She's conscious but experiencing tremors." As I spoke, Olivia's glassy eyes locked onto mine. The usual cold calculation in her gaze had vanished, replaced with raw, desperate fear. "Rachel," she gasped. "You switched them. You knew." "Ma'am, the ambulance is on its way," the dispatcher assured me. "Please stay on the line." Across the room, Daniel was panicking, kneeling beside Olivia as her body convulsed. "Olivia, what's happening?" That wasn't supposed to. He stopped himself, but the words had already slipped out. Olivia's head jerked toward him, her face contorted in pain. "Shut up, Daniel." Her voice was tight with fury, momentarily overcoming her distress. "This is all your fault. You said it would just make her sick enough to miss the board meeting next week. You promised it wouldn't be traced." My blood ran cold. The board meeting. The one where I was set to present my proposal for a major client. The same account Olivia had been after for months at our competing firms. It all made sense now. "The tea last month," I said, my voice steady despite the sick realization settling in. "The breakfast 2 months ago. Those weren't accidents, were they?" Olivia's face twisted with another wave of pain. She tried to sit up but fell back against the floor. "The tea was supposed to keep you home during the Johnson contract presentation," she choked out, clutching her stomach. "But you went anyway." She grimaced, her entire body trembling now. "Daniel said we just needed to discredit you. Make clients think you were unreliable." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Daniel stumbled back from Olivia, his face stark white. "Olivia, stop talking. You don't know what you're saying." But Olivia's rage burned through her pain. "I know exactly what I'm saying," she spat, her words slurring slightly. "We've been planning this for months, ever since Rachel started outperforming me. You were supposed to make sure she drank it today." The front door burst open as paramedics rushed inside. I quickly stepped aside, letting them work. As they loaded Olivia onto a stretcher, I stopped recording and immediately sent the video to my private email. Then I sent it to my lawyer. Daniel stood frozen, his entire world unraveling before him. I turned to the paramedics. "I'll ride with her to the hospital," I said firmly. Then I turned back to Daniel, meeting his wide, terrified gaze. "I'm sure the doctors will be very interested in knowing exactly what was in that coffee." His face drained of color. Because he knew. It was over. The emergency room at Charleston General Hospital was a flurry of activity as doctors and nurses moved swiftly, working to stabilize Olivia. I sat in the waiting area, my phone clutched tightly in my hand, replaying the recording of her confession over and over. The tremors in her voice, the sheer panic in her eyes, it was all the proof I needed. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. This was real. A nurse stepped into the waiting area, glancing down at her clipboard. Family of Olivia Carter? I stood up immediately, noticing that Daniel was nowhere to be seen. He had mumbled something about parking the car nearly 20 minutes ago and hadn't returned. I'm her sister-in-law, I said, following the nurse through the double doors. How is she? The nurse's expression was unreadable. She's stabilized, but we found some concerning levels of toxins in her system. She hesitated before adding, the doctor would like to discuss some unusual findings in her blood work. Dr. Phillips, a tall woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, was waiting by Olivia's room. Mrs. Turner, she addressed me formally. Can you walk me through exactly what happened before your sister-in-law became ill? I exhaled slowly, then pulled out my phone. I think you should listen to this first. I pressed play. The doctor's expression shifted from professional concern to outright alarm as Olivia's confession played out. This is serious, Dr. Phillips muttered, making notes on her tablet. The substance we found isn't something that ends up in coffee by accident. We're looking at deliberate contamination. Just then, Daniel appeared at the end of the hallway. His face was pale, beads of sweat gathering at his temple. His eyes darted between me and the doctor. He had clearly overheard enough to realize that everything was unraveling. Rachel, he started, taking a step toward me. Let me explain. Dr. Phillips immediately pressed the nurse's call button. Security to room 412, please. Daniel raised his hands in surrender. This is all a misunderstanding. Olivia was confused. She didn't know what she was saying. I let out a humorless laugh and pulled up my phone again. Oh, really? So these messages between you and Olivia about making sure I'm out of commission before the Henderson presentation were just casual work talk. His face went sheet white. You went through my phone? After I found that mysterious file in your desk drawer? Yeah, I did. I turned to Dr. Phillips. Doctor, I've been hospitalized 3 times in the last 6 months with unexplained symptoms. I need to know if they match what you found in Olivia's system today. The doctor's eyes darkened. We'll need to run tests to compare, but if there's a pattern, she glanced at the security guards who had just arrived. Mr. Turner, you're going to need to remain here for questioning. The 2 guards stepped forward, positioning themselves on either side of Daniel. His carefully composed mask cracked, revealing the raw panic beneath. Rachel, please, he pleaded. Olivia and we were just trying to help you. By poisoning me? I demanded. His lips trembled. You were working too hard, taking all the biggest clients. Olivia said if we could just slow you down a little, force you to take time off, you wouldn't be so stressed. A bitter laugh escaped me. So your solution was to poison me? Daniel winced at the word. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. Just enough to make you rest, take a break. Was it you who tampered with my food at the Christmas party too? His silence was my answer. Through the window, I could see Olivia lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, her bravado completely gone. All that remained was the raw fear of someone who knew she had finally been caught. Dr. Phillips turned to me. Detective Mendoza is on her way. She'll want to take official statements from everyone involved. I nodded, my body tense but my mind oddly clear. The truth was out. There was no undoing this. Within the hour, Detective Mendoza arrived, a woman with sharp eyes and a presence that demanded attention. She was seasoned, experienced, and specialized in cases like these, ones that blurred the lines between domestic abuse, financial sabotage, and attempted harm. She sat across from me, flipping through the notes Dr. Phillips had provided. Mrs. Turner, she said, her voice steady. You mentioned previous hospitalizations. Can you walk me through them? I took a deep breath and began. The first time was 6 months ago, after I had dinner with Daniel and Olivia at their house. I had severe nausea and dizziness. I thought it was food poisoning, but the symptoms lasted longer than they should have. Detective Mendoza nodded. And the second time? 4 months ago. I drank tea at Olivia's house, and within hours, I was in urgent care. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Mendoza made a note. And the third? I clenched my hands in my lap. 2 months ago. Breakfast at their house before an important meeting. I collapsed at work that afternoon. She paused, then asked, and you never suspected them before today? I swallowed hard. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence. That maybe I was overthinking. But when Olivia drank that coffee today and I saw the fear in her eyes, I knew. Mendoza nodded slowly. This is attempted poisoning at the very least. And given the repeated incidents, we're looking at felony charges. Daniel let out a strangled noise of protest, but Mendoza didn't even glance at him. We'll be taking both your husband and your sister-in-law into custody for further questioning. Based on the evidence, I suspect charges will be filed soon. Relief washed over me as the security guards tightened their grip on Daniel's arms. Olivia, still too weak to fight back, just closed her eyes in defeat. This was it. For months, I had doubted myself, wondered if I was imagining things, convinced myself I was being paranoid. But I wasn't. And now, they would finally face the consequences. Detective Mendoza's pen tapped against her notepad as she stared at Olivia, who was now visibly shaken in her hospital bed. Mild symptoms? Mendoza repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Ms. Carter, what exactly did you think would happen when you repeatedly poisoned your sister-in-law? From the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel standing just outside the room, his face pale as he listened in. Olivia, still trembling, looked like she was scrambling for an excuse, but nothing came. Dr. Phillips glanced at her tablet, her expression grim. The toxicology report shows elevated levels of several substances, she said, her tone clinical. The most concerning is a compound commonly used in pharmaceutical testing. It's not something an average person would have access to, which means someone went out of their way to get it. Olivia's face drained of color. That's impossible, she stammered. Daniel said it was just something mild, just enough to make Rachel sick for a day or two. I felt my stomach drop. All the lingering doubts, the moments where I had second-guessed myself, were wiped away. I turned to Detective Mendoza. I have more evidence. I pulled out my phone again, opening a document I had been quietly maintaining for months. The first time was in February, after a dinner at Olivia's house. Severe stomach pain and dizziness. Then in April, the tea incident. And again in June, after breakfast with them. My voice remained steady, though my hands trembled slightly as I scrolled through the detailed log. Each time, the symptoms were just different enough that doctors couldn't pinpoint a cause. But the pattern was clear, and that's why I started keeping records. Mendoza's sharp eyes scanned the document. You've been tracking this. I nodded. Ever since I noticed a pattern. Then, I reached into my purse and pulled out another phone. I also started carrying a backup phone, with a different number. I used it to record conversations when I was around them. Mendoza's gaze flicked between me and the phone. And what did you find? I pressed play. Olivia's voice came through first, crystal clear. The Henderson account is worth millions, Daniel. We can't let her ruin everything we've worked for. Just stick to the plan. A few days of illness should be enough. A beat of silence. Then, Daniel's voice, cold and calculating. I've got something stronger this time. She won't make it to the presentation. Detective Mendoza's expression hardened. She turned to the officers by the door. We need both of their phones. Now. At that moment, a commotion erupted in the hallway. I turned just in time to see Daniel struggling against the security guards, his voice rising in desperation. I need to speak with my wife, he shouted. Rachel, please. You don't understand. We were trying to protect you. Mendoza stepped forward, blocking him from coming any closer. Mr. Turner, you're not helping your case. Daniel let out a hollow laugh that echoed through the sterile hospital corridor. Premeditated? You think this was premeditated? His voice cracked, his carefully crafted defense beginning to unravel. We were just trying to slow her down. She was working herself to death, taking all the biggest accounts. Olivia said if we could just make her take some time off. By poisoning me? My voice was calm, but my hands clenched into fists. Daniel swallowed hard. It wasn't. Then tell me, Daniel, I cut him off. When you put something in my coffee this morning, what was supposed to happen? His silence spoke louder than any confession ever could. Through the hospital room window, I saw Olivia watching us, her expression a mixture of fear and calculation. She was thinking, strategizing, trying to find a way out. I could see it in her eyes. But there was no escaping this. Detective Mendoza turned to the security guards. I want officers posted at both doors. Nobody leaves until we get the final toxicology results. One of the guards stepped forward. Detective, we have their phones. Mendoza took them, turning them over in her hands before sliding them into evidence bags. Then, she turned to me. Rachel, I'll need your full statement. And after what I just heard, I'm also going to recommend formal charges for attempted poisoning. Possibly attempted murder. A sharp intake of breath from Daniel. A broken gasp from Olivia. I exhaled slowly. This was it. The moment everything changed. Dr. Phillips re-entered the room, looking graver than before. Detective, I have the final toxicology results. Mendoza and I stepped into Olivia's room. She tried to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, but her body was still weak. Dr. Phillips looked straight at her. Miss Carter, the substances in your system are consistent with what we found in Rachel's blood work from her previous hospitalizations. My stomach twisted. You've been poisoning me for months, I whispered. And today, you finally tasted your own medicine. Olivia's breathing was ragged. No, it wasn't supposed to be like this. Then how is it supposed to be? Mendoza challenged, her pen poised over her notepad. Silence. Then, a broken whisper. It was just supposed to make her sick. The detective exchanged a look with Dr. Phillips. Not good enough. She turned to the officers at the door. Arrest them both. Daniel let out a choked sound as the security guards grabbed him. Rachel, please. You have to believe me. We were just trying to help you. But I wasn't listening. I stepped to the side as they hauled Daniel and Olivia out of the hospital room, their desperate pleas falling on deaf ears. For months, I had doubted myself. I had wondered if I was imagining things. But now? Now, I had the truth. And they would finally face the consequences. The door swung open, and another detective stepped inside, holding an evidence bag. We found these in Mr. Turner's office desk at Carter and Associates, he reported, presenting several small bottles with clinical labels, along with a notebook filled with meticulous notes. I felt my knees weaken as I took in the sight of the bottles, their sterile white labels stamped with pharmaceutical codes. You were documenting everything, I whispered, my voice hollow. Like some kind of experiment. It wasn't like that. Olivia protested, her voice wavering. We just needed to track what worked. The first few attempts weren't effective enough. She kept showing up to meetings anyway. Detective Mendoza's jaw tightened as she flipped through the notes. So you increased the dosages. Olivia looked away. Did you know these substances could be lethal in higher concentrations? Mendoza asked, holding up one of the bottles. Silence. Through the window, I saw Daniel sitting in a chair in the hallway, his head buried in his hands. The pieces finally clicked into place. The Henderson account, I said slowly, the weight of realization settling over me. It wasn't just about that presentation, was it? You needed me out of the way permanently. Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands gripping the edge of the hospital blanket. You were ruining everything, she hissed. I built that client portfolio for years. Then you showed up, and suddenly, everyone wanted to work with you instead. Daniel flinched, but he didn't deny it. So he decided to fix the problem, I continued, staring at my husband, my voice as sharp as glass. By killing me. The words hung in the air, suffocating in their weight. We weren't trying to, Olivia started, but Dr. Phillips cut her off. The concentration in today's coffee, the doctor said, staring directly at Olivia, was significantly higher than previous samples we analyzed from Rachel's earlier hospital visits. If she had consumed it, the outcome would have been severe, possibly fatal. Detective Mendoza turned to an officer. We need a full warrant for both their homes and offices. Also, contact the pharmaceutical company listed on these bottles. We need to know how they obtained these substances. The fight drained from Olivia's face. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered. Daniel kept saying we just needed one more try. I stepped closer, my voice steady despite the tremble in my hands. "Every time I got sick, every meeting I missed, every client I lost, you were both there. Watching, taking notes on how your poison was affecting me." The silence was deafening. Outside, I heard Daniel being read his rights as additional officers arrived. Olivia sat motionless in her hospital bed, staring at her lap. I turned to Detective Mendoza. "I'm ready to make my formal statement now." 3 weeks later, the trial. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but it felt like years. I sat in the courtroom each day, watching as the prosecution meticulously laid out their case against Daniel and Olivia. The evidence was overwhelming. The bottles found in Daniel's office. The notebook documenting each poisoning attempt. The recorded conversations and text messages discussing their plans. But what struck me most was their demeanor throughout the proceedings. Olivia, usually so polished and confident, looked small in the defendant's chair. Daniel wouldn't even look at me, his gaze fixed on the floor as expert witnesses detailed the potentially lethal effects of the substances they had been using. Dr. Phillips' testimony was the most damning. She presented a comprehensive analysis showing how they had gradually increased the dosages over time, demonstrating a clear intent to cause harm. Then came the pharmaceutical company representative, confirming that Daniel had stolen the compounds through a college friend working in their research department. When the prosecutor made her closing statement, her words were unshakable. The defendants engaged in a calculated, systematic attempt to harm Mrs. Turner. This wasn't just corporate sabotage, it was a clear escalation that could have resulted in her death. When the verdict was read, I felt no joy, only relief. Guilty. On multiple counts, including heavy checkmark attempted murder, heavy checkmark conspiracy, heavy checkmark illegal possession of toxic substances. The judge's words echoed through the silent courtroom. The premeditated nature of these actions, carried out against a family member over an extended period, demands the maximum sentence. I watched as they were led away in handcuffs, thinking about how greed and jealousy had twisted two people I once trusted into something unrecognizable. Their business, reputation, and freedom. All sacrificed in their attempt to destroy me. 1 year later, the keynote speech. I stood at the podium of the Charleston Business Leaders Conference, preparing to give the keynote speech. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was exactly the kind of opportunity Olivia had tried to keep me from achieving. The Henderson account, which she and Daniel had been so desperate to steal, had led to even more major clients. Now, I was one of the top marketing executives in the region. I took a deep breath, scanning the sea of faces before me. Success isn't just about talent or hard work, I began. It's about integrity. About building genuine relationships based on trust. I let the words sink in. Sometimes, the biggest threats to our success come from those closest to us. But surviving those challenges makes us stronger. After my speech, several young professionals approached me for advice. One woman, her eyes bright with determination, asked, "How did you stay so composed through everything?" I smiled. I focused on what I could control. I gathered evidence, trusted my instincts, and refused to let fear stop me from pursuing my goals. Later that evening, an email popped up on my phone. Henderson and Company. Contract renewal, 3 years. I smiled, thinking about how differently things could have turned out if I had ignored my instincts that day at brunch. That morning, the local paper had run a small article about Olivia and Daniel beginning their prison sentences. I didn't read it. Instead, I focused on my next proposal, knowing that the best revenge wasn't about getting even. It was about moving forward and succeeding despite those who tried to tear me down. I've shared my story, the betrayal, the deception, and the fight to reclaim my life. But now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever experienced a moment where your instincts told you something wasn't right? If you have, trust me, you're not alone. Drop a comment below and tell me, what stood out to you the most in my journey? What advice would you give someone who's facing betrayal from those closest to them? Your words have power, and you never know who might need to hear them. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt gaslight, underestimated, or manipulated, let's turn that pain into strength. Let's create a space where we lift each other up, where we trust our instincts and refuse to let anyone steal our success or our peace of mind. Now, let's talk. What's your biggest takeaway from my story? How will you apply these lessons in your own life? I'm here, I'm listening, and I can't wait to hear from you.